Tonya Eberhard, Contemporary Muse. Black bile simmering in a black cauldron, acid burning in the stomach, a fire to the heart, like the touch of one temporary muse. Witch's brew, she knew of other charms besides kissing frog to prince, boy to man. Mother witch, creator of muses, making morning grow dark, darker than black boughs snaking across the sky. Sweeten the pot. Here, she pointed with a crooked finger. There, the temporary muse. At the stomach, the heart. A churning, a groaning from the throat, spitting black bile, creating a muse made from the self. Otherworldly, yes. Of mystical powers, no. A ghost of flesh and bone, heart of false valor, tongue of pure stone. Witch's brew, she knew flame to heart makes it beat faster. Heart palpitations are fiery passions. She will love him. She loves him. She does say, I do. Well, when I was younger, especially when I first started writing poetry, my own experiences were my inspiration and springboard for my writing, and poetry was a form of communication that I found could really express my emotions with brevity and precision. As I've gotten older, I find myself using poetry as a way to step outside of myself, to write about historical events or other people's experiences, but memories are always a useful resource that I tap into still every now and then. So Contemporary Muse is about drawing inspiration from your relationship with yourself and a relationship with another person in a romantic sense. A phrase many people are familiar with in terms of art and music is "you are my muse," which we can trace back to the muses of Greek mythology that served as an inspiration or knowledge for poetry and music. So the poem is a more contemporary version of that. It's also about putting someone on a pedestal and seeing them as this kind of divine ethereal being that's so inspiring to someone, but ultimately it kind of ends up being a disappointment as well, because, you know, they're human and they're flawed, just like everyone else. The poem also focuses on the relationship with the self, and that why do we need to feel the need to create these illusions or these false perceptions in order to write something that we would consider good. And there's also the physical element of discomfort throughout the poem that kind of ties into this previous idea. In terms of poetic form, I'd say the poem is more free verse. I mean, there are some sections where there's a little bit of rhyming at the end, but this poem isn't really restricted to any meter or rhyme scheme necessarily. So with this poem, I was focused on mapping out a certain train of thought, building up to a progression, a realization that, you know, would ultimately wind down to an ending or conclusion. And so with this method, I'm very conscious of how the poem looks in terms of line breaks and stanzas, and just making sure that all the lines are grouped together correctly so that the ideas and the thoughts appear organized and coherent on the page, and it's easy for the reader to kind of follow along and understand what the poem is about. I'd probably say it took me maybe 2 or 3 drafts, so like maybe a few hours or so. A lot of the times when I write poetry, I'll write a draft and then kind of set it aside, and then I'll come back to it and kind of rework it with fresh eyes. And for me, I mean, depending on how many drafts I do, can take up to a few hours total. I'd say start with your own experiences and memories, especially if you don't know what to write about. I think that memories are a wonderful, elusive thing. Memories are always shifting. They're always changing. They're not stagnant. Often how you remember a event now will be different from how you remember it, say, a year from now or 10 years from now. And if you compare that memory to someone else's recollection of who was there, it'll oftentimes be a different account. So memories, I think, are such a rich resource for creativity. I think one aspect that would help someone understand poetry better is follow the punctuation. I think that poetry can be difficult to read or seem difficult to read or be a turnoff for some people just because of all the weird line breaks. And I think it's important to use the period, the comma, the semicolon, to use it as a guide as to when to pause and when to start reading again. For me, line breaks are more of a way to organize your thoughts. And it's not necessarily a signal to pause. I mean, otherwise, if you read a poem and you stop at the end of every line, the poem will read kind of choppy. It may be even more confusing and even more difficult to understand. So if you read poetry by focusing on the punctuation in that, say, like you're reading a book, I think that it makes it so much more easier to understand the language. Yeah, so one of my favorite poetry collections is Solve for Desire by Caitlin Bailey. It focuses on the relationship between the two siblings, Gregor and Gret Chackle, throughout their life in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So it's not only a collection of poems, but it's also a historical account told through the lens of poetry, which I really enjoy. And both of their lives ended so tragically that there's this tone of bereft-ness, loneliness, and alienation that I find so poignant and beautiful, and it's something that lingers throughout the entire collection. And it's something that really resonated with me, and I really think that what makes a good poem is the writer's ability to use sometimes just basic language to evoke so many complex emotions within the reader that are hard for them to pinpoint. To me, that's a poem well written. Probably Milkweed Editions. I mean, I interned with, they're a publishing company in Minneapolis and in Minnesota, and I interned with them a few years ago, and it was such a wonderful experience. And it was actually through that nonprofit organization that introduced me to Caitlin Bailey's poetry collection, Solve for Desire, and I think the work they put out is wonderful, and they do such a good job. And I was honored to be able to intern with them and just to be a part of the organization.